future ghost. And I'm actually getting ready to publish my second book, Recollections of a Future Ghost, this Halloween, October 31st. I am an independent author. I went on my own and published my two books, and I can talk a little bit about that towards the end of my talk. But I guess what I wanted to talk to you all tonight about is how I got into writing about the paranormal and how I got into investigating the paranormal in the first place. Like most Americans, I do have a fear of death. A lot of us have a fear of the unknown and anything that we can't figure out or explain. And so I've had this fear throughout my entire life, especially as a child. And I had learned how to cope with that by, through different mechanisms. And everything was fine through adulthood until I had children. And once I had my children, it got a lot more difficult for me to deal with death. I not only suffered from some postpartum depression and anxiety. My twins, my first two children, they were in the NICU for 20 days. And so that made me very anxious. And I realized that I wasn't any longer concerned with my future death. I was actually now concerned with theirs. And you know, new mothers don't like to be separated from their children, which is understandable. And all I could think about was that inevitable separation someday when I die. And people talk about how difficult the sex talk is. Oh my gosh, we had to have the sex talk with the kids. To me, the most difficult discussion to have with your children is the death talk. When your pet first dies or the first relative passes away, it's hard explaining to little children what that process is and what's happened. And I was a member of a Presbyterian church growing up, and I had faith and belief until I hit about 45, when I finally admitted to myself that, you know what, I'm an atheist. I had tried to use every other term in the book, agnostic and deist and many other terms. And I finally had to admit to myself, okay, I never called myself an atheist because I was afraid of that word, but that's what I am. So a lot of the platitudes of religion really didn't comfort me. And I knew they wouldn't comfort my children. And, some of my upbringing involved some mental health issues with the adults in my life. And one of the things I vowed as a mother was to never lie to my children, and I didn't want to lie to them. So I made sure that when we first had that talk about death was, I don't know really, because I've never died. So I don't know what happens. And I wanted to be able to impart to them that is something after death, that they would have something happen to them after death, wouldn't know what it would be, but that there is something there beyond death. And I wanted that answer for myself. And about the time I had my third child was the time when all of the paranormal TV shows got really popular on television, the reality shows, Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, all of those. So I started watching those. And I couldn't believe it. I was like, wow, people actually do this? I saw Amityville Horror, back in the 70s, 80s, those movies. But I didn't know that people did that in real life. So a friend of mine got me out of the house, took me on a, ghost tour in local Roswell, Georgia. And I really enjoyed it. And the woman who ran the tour was actually getting ready to start her own paranormal investigative group. So I went to her and asked her, hey, are you looking for members? And she said, actually, yeah. So I joined. And it was the perfect time to join because, my kids didn't need me in the middle of the night. They were sleeping well through the night. All the investigations happened on Fridays and Saturdays. And up to this point, I'd never had my own paranormal experience. And I was not only, I was yearning for that experience for myself, but also to find answers. And it took a couple of years for something to truly happen to me before I felt comfortable enough to say to other people, as well as my husband, okay, and the children, yes, I finally know that there's something after death. And so what I loved about my group was that we go about we use the scientific method when we're investigating. And I have a science background. I have a degree in physics. And so that really is something that drew me to join that group. as well in investigating the paranormal was not what you saw on television with just running everywhere willy-nilly and doing it for shock value. So I appreciated that we used control groups and experimental groups, and that we, tried to debunk claims of the paranormal more so than actually proving the claims of the paranormal. And that impressed me quite a bit. A year and a half in, several of us got a little bit discouraged with how the group was being run. So we actually formed our own group, and that group became known as Paranormal Georgia Investigations. And I helped co found it 11 years ago, and investigating the paranormal ever since. I haven't really done any famous places. I've gone on my own to Waverly Hills Sanatorium and to a little place called Old South Pittsburgh Hospital in South Pittsburgh, Tennessee. And I've also investigated Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary in Petros, Tennessee, and the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City, Missouri. And those have been fun investigations. Those are like vacations. The typical bread and butter investigations that I do involve private homes and businesses of people living in the Atlanta, Georgia area who feel like they have something going on in their home or their business they can't explain. And honestly, most of the time, people appreciate just having someone to talk to that doesn't respond to them, "Oh, you're crazy, you're imagining it." You're not. You know, everyone has these experiences. One of my favorite things, I used to get the Scientific American magazine, and one of my favorite articles was, of course, in an October issue. And it was about one of the columnists who is a scientist who had something explainable happen with a radio he had inherited from his father. And the radio started making noise with no batteries, and it wasn't plugged in. And so I loved that even he, as a scientist, couldn't fully explain what was happening with that radio. And so, we've investigated the paranormal, and not only have we investigated and helped people either understand what's happening in their homes or understand that they're not going crazy, we've also tried to start a data collective of, the kinds of things that we're investigating, and not just, okay, we got a piece of video evidence or a piece of audio evidence at this location, but hey, there were 4 women investigating, and there were 2 men, and there are, 2 men who live at this location, and 2 females, and there's, this kind of geologic formation under the house, this kind of seismic activity, this kind of space weather, etc. So we're trying to track trends, because any sort of trend that we can find could, indicate a spike in paranormal activity, or, that type of thing. But we also have to take into account the people at the location too. So what got me wanting to write a book about the paranormal was, I've always wanted to write something. And I started out in my professional life as a technical writer, writing hardware and software manuals. And, that was okay, but it's dry, it's soulless. And I love reading. I absolutely adore books of all genres. I love biographies and historical books, as well as fiction and sci-fi and everything in between, and romance, and you name it, I'll read it. And so I thought about, okay, well, you kind of need to cut your teeth when you're writing. And I thought, okay, to get me into this, I need to write what I know. And what I know is the paranormal. And as the years have gone by, as the paranormal reality shows have gotten more popular, I have personally gotten more irritated, because they are so far from the reality of investigating paranormal. There are some pieces of equipment that we use that are similar to what they use on the shows. And I have found some of their investigative techniques to be helpful. Either I'm never doing that, or, oh, I haven't tried that before. But for the most part, those are, those shows are for entertainment purposes. It's for 45 minutes of just to shock you and scare you out of your seat. What's really what paranormal investigating is really like is a lot of boredom, and a lot of listening to audio, a lot of watching video where nothing happens. And most of the time we don't have evidence to give back to our clients. And so I have found a lot of times that investigating the paranormal is more about the living than the dead. because what we're dealing with is the psychology of the living. And, people watch Amityville Horror and they watch the scary movies that come out of Hollywood and they watch the paranormal reality TV shows and they're influenced by their faith. And so a lot of people assume that the footsteps on the stairs are evil, and they're not. And it's our perceptions of the paranormal that color, how we deal with it. So a lot of what we do is calming people down. And I wanted people to understand that there is a human face, whether it's a deceased human or if it's the living human that we're, who are our clients. So I wanted people to see what it's like investigating the paranormal. And of course, I'm not famous at all. I don't have a camera crew following me around, so I can't do it on a TV show. The easiest way for me to do that would be to write a book, which is what I did. And I wanted people to see that human face. And so the fine line for me has been, my paranormal team, when I told them I was writing these books, they were like, "Oh yeah, use my name. It's great. No worries." But the clients have all of our clients, except for I think one, when we go to their home, we have them sign a form that says, "Oh, sure. If you find evidence, share it online and share my address." No one's ever signed that portion of the form. Mostly what people agree to is, yes, feel free to share my evidence online, but please don't tell anybody where you got it from. So I can share the stories, but I can't share the names and the locations. So, everything in my book is true, but I've had to change names and genders and locations and, places, that kind of thing. So, this client who I say lives in Cumming, Georgia, and may not live there at all, may live somewhere else in South Georgia. Who knows? So that's probably been the most difficult. Of course, the other thing that I've had to do with writing this book is making sure that, I don't in any way, I don't know, even though I'm changing names of clients, I don't want them in any way to pick up this book and see themselves in this book. And I don't want them to think that I'm in any way speaking negatively about them, because there have been some investigations that we've had where clients are clearly mentally ill. So I want to show that to the public of, okay, sometimes this is mental illness. Sometimes, from standing back from my third person view of this is something going on in their brains. This isn't external to them. So it's always a delicate balance of making sure I don't reveal identities, making sure that there's absolutely no way that anyone can peg this on any one person, but at the same time giving respect to those stories. When I first started writing this, I wanted to, I wanted to find a publisher. I wanted to find a literary agent. I was like, yeah, I'm going to shop this around. And so I checked on the databases for literary agents, and okay, so I'm supposed to type in, a genre that this is attached to find an agent that's interested in that. So of course I typed in paranormal. Well, guess what? A lot of them are looking for paranormal erotica. That's not what this is. So yeah, there's really not a huge market for paranormal nonfiction. It's mostly fiction in the form of romance, and awkward romance at that. So if any of you are interested in writing paranormal erotica, you got a market. I don't, but I did actually shop it around for about a year, and tons of rejections. And of course, I actually got one nibble, which was exciting, but then it was a rejection, but that's okay. And I knew the book was finished. I'd had it professionally edited. I was so proud of it. And at that point I thought, I'm done. This is the 21st century. And so I decided to go through Ingram Spark or Ingram Publishing, just so that bookstores and libraries, it would be available for them, independent bookstores and libraries to order through their what's the word I'm looking for, through their catalog and their website. And then I've also placed it on Amazon through Amazon's Create Space. And that way it's available on Amazon as a Kindle and as a paperback, as well as Barnes and Noble and Apple iBooks and your local bookseller and that kind of thing. And so, as far as being an independent author and publisher, I felt like that was the best option for me, was going Ingram as well as Amazon and covering both of those bases. Um, I've had a lot of success with it. Now, I will say, as an independent author, it's been easy for me because I have a friend who's also involved in investigating the paranormal with me. She owns a local shop. She keeps a stack of my books by her cash register. That helps. So having a place where you can have it in front of people's faces is nice. Um, so, but it's been difficult. I think the hardest part for me has been, you know, marketing myself. And people love the paranormal, but sometimes they don't want the true paranormal. And so, I try to market myself, and when I do, I try to share the more scarier of the stories that I have in my books. And then maybe that'll draw people in, and they'll read it and still appreciate even those stories that don't have a scary result to it. So, I hope that explained a lot. I hope that explained somewhat, but I was going to go ahead and open it up to questions, if that's okay, and see if anyone had any questions, or if not, I can keep talking about investigations that I've done.
I would actually love to hear about one of your investigations.
Sure,
Plenty of questions.
sure. Probably one of my most favorite investigations was, we were at a mall here in suburban Atlanta. And the mall at one time had 5 anchor stores. And one of those anchor stores had gone out of business, and the mall was using that space to store holiday decorations. And other than that, it was empty. And one of the security guards, it was that whole friend of a friend thing. He was head of security for the mall. And that side of the mall, where those shops were located and where that anchor store was located, his security guards and staff were having experiences that they couldn't explain. So he asked us to come in and investigate. And we had spent the entire, we had broken up into 2 teams, and our team spent its entire time on the main floor, the first floor. The escalators were turned off. There weren't any lights on. And there was actually ambient light coming in from the parking lot and shining down the escalator into that lower level where we were. And we had already spent our time going around the entire lower level investigating. Hadn't had anything happen to us. And I have to note that when we walked up and down the escalator, it was loud. Those escalators, they're metal. And when we investigate, we don't wear open-toed shoes, sandals, or anything like that. We're usually in boots or sneakers. So you could hear people coming up and down that escalator, and there wasn't any other way down except for elevators. And the main entrance to the mall was boarded up. So you couldn't get out into the mall or vice versa. So we had decided, okay, when we investigate, we'll either ask pointed questions, we'll chit chat amongst ourselves, hey, how you doing, catch up, or we'll just be silent. And sometimes we'll do all 3. And this was the portion of the night where we decided, let's sit down and just be quiet. So we went into the old children's section of the store, which was across from the escalator, and we all sat down with our backs to one another, just so that we could see the entire area around us. And I was facing the escalator, and there was light coming in from upstairs. And I saw a figure appear, and it was completely black. There was enough light that a person standing there, I would have seen some features. This person was just solid inky black. And it moved from left to right in front of me at the base of the escalator. And it walked, and then it was gone. And it did it silently. There was no sound. I couldn't explain it. And of course, it took me a moment for my brain to register what I'd seen. And then I said out loud, did anybody else see that? And the gentleman sitting next to me said, oh yeah, I wondered if you were going to say anything. So of course, our first response was, oh my gosh, that was so cool. And then the second response was, okay, let's see if we can recreate this. So of course, we radioed to the other team. Did anybody come downstairs? No, they didn't. We all checked. No one else was there. We tried to recreate it, and there was too much light for anyone to just be a black figure. There was enough light that you could see faces, nose, ears, hair. And I still don't have an explanation for that to this day. It was one of my favorite moments in investigating.
Yeah, that sounds like a great story.
Yeah.
And I can imagine that it had a pretty profound impact. Um, More related to the writing aspect, one
Hmm.
of the questions that I had was, so when you're writing about the paranormal,
Hmm.
and assumedly you're not going to do any paranormal erotic anytime soon, uh,
Thank
what is
goodness.
one of the more challenging aspects of writing about the paranormal for your audience, especially since you already know to some extent what their expectations, good or bad, may
Hmm.
be?
Um, I wanted there to be a story. It needs to be. When I first started writing this, it was like a collection of essays. And my editor said, okay, I understand that, you want this to be, this is nonfiction. This is a memoir of sorts, a biography, things that happened to you. And he said, but there needs to be people. Especially there are some chapters where I talk science, where I'm trying to delve into the science of the paranormal, and he's like, "That's great, but let's not have this Tom Clancy moment in the middle of the book where it's all, philosophy and political philosophy. Let's have science, but let's put the story with it and have dialogue." And so I am very much an explainer where, when I write, I try to explain. I guess that's the technical writer in me. And he was like, okay, let's explain that, but let's use people to explain it. So some of the conversations between my paranormal investigators in the book are, sometimes they're conversations that actually happen, and sometimes it's me pretending that I'm having a conversation with them about the science of it, or something that happened. Um, but he was like, you need to definitely have that more of a human interaction, so that readers can connect. And of course, I wanted to make sure that the readers got the ending of the investigations, that there was, a resolution to the investigations, which most of the time there isn't. I don't always get, to go back to the client's house and tell them what happened and get hugs and, oh yeah, come back 15 more times and that kind of thing. But I definitely wanted to make sure that readers had a resolution, and that, if it was a scary investigation, that maybe they, want to turn on their lights in their living room while they're reading it. So that was my goal.
Could you talk actually a little bit about the science of investigation, Heather?
Sure. Um, like I mentioned before, we will have two groups. Our investigators will show up at a location, and we'll break them up into two groups: a control group and an experimental group. The control group knows nothing about the investigation except for the address. They don't know, what the client's experiencing, what the possible history of the location is. They don't know anything. The experimental group knows everything. Typically, the experimental group has the case manager as part of it, because the case manager has done the phone interview with the client. So he or she fills everyone else in that group in on what's happening. The experimental group, when they investigate, they of course can ask pointed questions, because, the client may have said, oh, the activity is all in my living room and kitchen, and I always see a male form. So, of course, the experimental group will focus their investigation in those two rooms, and they'll ask pointed questions about a male spirit that may be there. Whereas the control group, they're probably going to roam around the house, ask generic questions about, are you male or female? That kind of thing. And so the goal of that is that if the experimental group and the control group have similar experiences that they can't debunk, then that validates the client's claim of the paranormal. And of course, if those experiences match the client's experiences, that's even better. Um, Something else that we try to do, of course, is we use electromagnetic field detectors, similar to what electricians use. And the reason why we use those is because a high electromagnetic field actually can affect the living. Um, Dizziness, paranoia, nausea, That's why a lot of times when unfinished basements, especially in those houses, built in the 70s, 60s, 50s, unfinished basements had a lot of unshielded wiring. And, oh, hi there. And that unshielded wiring, we would all go down in those basements as kids or as young adults, and they would creep us out. And a lot of times it was the high electromagnetic field. So we're taking our EM meters and trying to see, are there any high fields in the house? We had a client who lived near Lake Lanier, beautiful lake house. And he called us in because he was actually having episodes of sleepwalking and nightmares and a lot of activity in his bedroom. We found out that the main power coming into his house was coming in behind the head of his bed. And the electromagnetic field where he was laying every night was off the scale. It was actually kind of scary. So we literally told him, we said, okay, maybe get in an electrician, but also move your bed to the other wall. And when we checked in with him a month or two later, he was fine. He had moved his bed. He was sleeping better. He wasn't sleepwalking. He wasn't having as much activity to report in his bedroom. So even things like that can cause a perception of paranormal activity. So those are a couple of the things that we do as far as the science goes. I know a lot of people, watch the paranormal reality shows, and the reality shows talk about limestone. There's the building's made out of limestone. No wonder there's so much activity, or there's a limestone deposit under the house. And I have a huge problem with that because limestone is simply a sedimentary rock. It doesn't have any electrical value. To me, if you're going to look at geology of a location to see if that is causing paranormal activity, then I think it would be more likely to be quartz or quartz containing rocks, because of course quartz is a rock that if you apply pressure to it, you'll get an electric charge, and that's the piezoelectric effect. That's why we have quartz watches, that type of thing. But of course, quartz under your house won't cause paranormal activity, but that's why we look at the geology of a location, because we're trying to prove or disprove that these things can cause activity. Something else that a lot of people like to claim causes increase in activity are thunderstorms or, solar flares, increased geomagnetic activity. And so again, those are things that we look at prior to our investigations just to see, is it a contributing factor? So far, we don't think it is, but we're just one team that's investigated for 11 years. And, it's going to need several lifetimes of data to see if it is a trend. And that's why I think the paranormal it shouldn't be a fun little, fad. It should actually be something that we are taking as a generational study to see, what is this? Even if it's not the dead roaming our homes, what is it? What is it that is causing this activity, this, perception of paranormal activity, or what is causing it? So yeah, that's some of the science I like to geek out on. So, and hi, Andy, glad you made it.
Andy, while you're here, do you have a question or a comment?
I was actually watching from the start on YouTube, but I got
Okay.
jealous when I saw Kevin Knott was in Zoom, so I decided I wanted to be with the cool kids also.
Awesome.
Do you can you recommend? I mean, I share your dismay at a lot of those popular TV shows, but
Mhm.
are there any like books or authors or podcasts that you recommend that have more of the approach that you've described for yourself, whether they're current or historical?
Probably my favorite reality show that actually aired for 2 seasons was Ghost Mine, Mine. And it was 2 paranormal investigators that actually followed a group of miners trying to get gold out of a mine out west somewhere. I don't know if it was Utah or Nevada. Patrick Doyle was one of the investigators. I can't remember the woman's name, Kristen something. But what I loved about their show was they actually were using a lot of the scientific method. And they had a dream location because for a paranormal investigator, you know, it it would be amazing to have a location that's mine, if that makes sense. Like it's got activity, it's got reported activity, and I get to go like every Friday and Saturday and investigate and gather data. But unfortunately, that's rare. And what was great about Ghost Mine is that this was the same location over 2 seasons, 2 years. And they not only investigated the mine, they also investigated the town, and they did a lot of historical research. So that's what I loved. And they weren't, like Zach Bagans running around willy-nilly, summoning demons and that kind of thing. They were really good at showing what it's really like to investigate the paranormal. Um, let's see. I also shoot. I can't recall the name of the show. It actually came on last year. There was one season of it. I don't know if they're continuing it, but Dave Schrader, who hosts Darkness Radio on online, he does online podcasts. He actually did this show. So you could look up Dave Schrader and see which show it was. But he is actually working with the the son of Hans Holzer, or the daughter. Hans Holzer was a well-known paranormal investigator, in the 60s and 50s. And they're actually reopening some of his cases. And I found that to be interesting, just that they're, the history of, because so many paranormal investigators, Hans Holzer was one of the first people whose books they read. And Hans Holzer had an interesting take on how to investigate the paranormal. He, of course, used a psychic that he trusted. So I would say that. Now, as far as podcasts go, I want to say, and of course, you're going to have to pardon me because I'm going to get out my phone to look, but I think there's a podcast that I've listened to that I really appreciated called, let's see, I think it's Paranormal Me and You, I think is what it's called. I'll find it. Yes, it is. Oh, Me and Paranormal You. And it's hosted by Ryan Singer. And it's actually a really great in-depth podcast that I've enjoyed watching, or excuse me, listening to, sorry. So I would say those three things I really like. And of course, shameless plug.
Speaking of revisiting old experiences and investigations, is there one in particular from your first or your upcoming book that you would like to revisit in the future? And could you maybe tell us a little bit about what was so intriguing about that particular case?
I definitely want to return to Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary in Petros, Tennessee. There's a chapter dedicated to it in my upcoming book. And my good friend Sean, I consider him to be a brother. He actually was on the investigation with us, and he's a police officer. And he's a very boisterous individual. And of course, he walked in there, just, I'm going to own this place. I'm a cop, and, I got this. And it actually backfired on him. He actually had some overwhelming negative emotions that affected him while he was there. And it was kind of scary, actually, because he's not a little guy. He's actually a big guy. And I would love to go back there, maybe not necessarily with him, because he had such a negative reaction, because that's understandable. It was one of the most violent prisons in Tennessee. It was a state penitentiary. It wasn't federal. And it actually started out as a coal mine. The prisoners would hot bunk. So you would have, 2 men sharing the same bunk. One was on for 12 hours while the other one slept, and then they switched. And it was a coal mine. They were actually mining coal in the hillside behind the prison. And eventually they mined out all the coal, and then it just became a straight prison. And it was closed, I think, in the 80s actually, it might have been in the early 2000s. And that's actually where James Earl Ray, the man who assassinated MLK Jr., was imprisoned until his death. That place is fascinating. I would love to go back for not just one night. I would love to go back there for like a week and just spend a week investigating there. That was one of my favorite places that I would love to revisit. Anyone else have any questions?
I have lots of questions.
Oh, yes.
So,
Give it to me.
we could spend all day, you and I. Uh, so, getting back to the science of investigation,
Mhm.
Are there new or interesting techniques that you haven't employed yet or that you've read about that seem really promising or interesting to you? And maybe tell us a little more about what specifically you like to employ in your investigations, because you talked about the control groups, but
Mhm.
I'm thinking about the technology, the devices, et cetera,
Right.
because that's so often associated with paranormal investigations.
Right. I would say probably the most promising piece of equipment that I have not been able to get my hands on because it's not cheap. Actually, there are two pieces of equipment. The first is, the strips that video games are now using to, um, I guess it started with the Wii games when you would do Wii bowling or Wii fishing or whatever, and it would actually map your body position so that you were part of the game, if that makes sense. And paranormal investigators have actually taken that technology because when it maps your body, you show up as a stick figure. So some investigators and some TV shows, reality shows, are actually using this technology and they're attaching it to an iPad so that whatever, it's facing outward and whatever it's detecting shows up on your iPad screen as a stick figure. So what I find fascinating is that investigators are using this, and of course it's mapping the investigators in the room or the camera crew, but it's also mapping things that aren't there, which I find fascinating. I have not gotten my hands on that. It's a bit expensive. The other thing that I would love to have is, of course, a thermal camera. Because, of course, a lot of times there's so many reflective surfaces in homes, glass cabinets, mirrors, windows, that kind of thing. But if you're mapping a figure that you cannot explain as a reflection of yourself on a surface, then what is that? And not only that, but from what I'm understanding is that they're mapping them at colder temperatures. Me as a person, I'll show up on a thermal camera as 98, 97, 99 degrees. These figures are showing up as 70, 60 degrees, 50, definitely colder than their surroundings. And they're showing up as human shaped figures or human movement. Even if it was animal movement, it shouldn't be registering that cold. So a thermal camera is another piece of equipment that I would love to get my mitts on. As far as my favorite things to use when I'm investigating, the K2 meters that you see on TV are simply electromagnetic field detectors that look good on TV. Instead of a digital number readout, it's lights. So if the light's in the green, it's a 0 milligauss electromagnetic field. But of course, if the light moves up to yellow or orange or red, it's a higher field. I do like using the K2 meters on investigations because most of the time we're stumbling around in the dark and it's easier to see. And there's a hypothesis in the paranormal field that a spike in the electromagnetic field could mean that something's trying to manifest itself, that it's drawing from the surrounding electromagnetic field around it to manifest. And so as long as you've got it sitting in a spot that isn't being affected by an appliance or wiring or anything of that nature, then you could be capturing something paranormal. I also use a voice recorder because most of the evidence that we seem to catch is audio in nature. And, my little digital recorder that, Samsung that I bought from Best Buy has been my best friend on, hundreds of investigations. And I love that thing. And I love leaving it in rooms where none of us are present and capturing voices that shouldn't be there. It's not a result of the magnetic tape or some anomaly. It's all digital. So it's just fascinating to me. So I'm definitely a K2 audio recorder kind of girl. I don't like carrying around a lot of equipment, but if I had that video game camera thing. And if I had a thermal camera, I'd probably need 2 more arms. So definitely go for it. Yes.
Had to unmute myself.
Yes.
This comes from one of our YouTubers
Oh, okay.
who emailed me and said, ask this question for me. So
Okay.
I'll just read it the way they sent it to me.
Mhm.
I am fascinated by stories about the paranormal. As someone who has never ever had a paranormal experience, but would like to, what would you recommend? My friends who have such experiences say it doesn't help that I'm a skeptic.
It's okay to be a skeptic. It's fine. I think the best way to have a paranormal experience is, of course, to go to a location that has a lot of them happening. Luckily for 21st century Americans, Waverly Hills Sanatorium, Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, Moundsville State Penitentiary, Brushy Mountain Penitentiary, Missouri State Penitentiary, all kinds of these, old hospital, mental institutions, prisons, you can actually pay to go investigate. What I love about these locations, it's not like an October, netherworld haunted house. They don't have it set up where the staff are there to scare you. Literally, when you go to these locations, they're like, okay, put your gear here. We're going to be here with all of your gear. Come back and get your snacks anytime you want. Otherwise, you have the run of the place. We'll see you later. And they vacate, or they sit off to another part of the property and they let you do what you want within reason, of course. So those locations have a lot of paranormal activity. So I suggest that you definitely go there. The other thing that I suggest that you do is you definitely want to be courteous. So many times, a lot of these people on reality shows, they just go in there, oh, you're going to talk to me and I want a response and this and that. Well, if you truly believe that what this is someone who has died, well, ghosts are people too. They were once people too. And so you're going to catch more flies with honey than you are with vinegar. Be courteous, be kind, be positive. Whatever you get out of, you're going to get out of the investigation what you put into it. And if you run in there expecting demons and a Ouija boards, yeah, you're going to scare the crap out of yourself and probably have a negative experience. But I'm very much a positive person. So, and go into it with a slight open mind and remember that, you know, ghosts don't perform on demand. You could spend $100 to go investigate Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum and nothing happens. And, that's a possibility. But I would say you're going to have a better chance at one of those places than you would at a friend's house down the street who they say they have a lot of activity. If you decide to go that route and go to the friend's house to try to have an experience, you may want to go to their house quite a bit, over successive weekends investigating rather than just one night, because that's a small window of opportunity. So have fun. Whatever you do, have fun.
I had one other question on my own
Go for it.
behalf.
Yes.
I just put God help me. I just put in a sabbatical application of compiling a whole master list of Western Maryland weird paranormal stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but odd history, fringe politics, scientific anomalies or oddities,
Mm-hmm.
roadside attractions, you name it. But particularly on the ghosts and hauntings element of things.
Mm-hmm.
How would you some of which gets published or written about at Halloween every year, but
Mm-hmm.
much of which is like hidden in historical archaeological society stuff, What suggestions do you have for finding all that stuff that's not the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, that hasn't like made the headlines?
Exactly.
Well,
Wow.
what suggestions do you have for finding and developing other sources for the current stuff and the historical stuff as well?
Um, yeah, definitely. Because a lot of the problem is, places like, for example, I live near Kennesaw Mountain Battlefield, which is, the site of an important, battle during Sherman's March to the Sea. So that, of course, is a national park, and parks like that, especially federal national parks, they want to talk about the living history, not not the dead. And so they're not going to allow paranormal investigators to come in. They're not going to talk about the ghosts, that kind of thing. So it's a lot of word of mouth. Um, you can sometimes, I think, talk to the historical society and ask, if there's a location that's haunted, and the historical society doesn't necessarily want to talk about the haunting of the location, you can certainly ask them if there's someone else that would speak to that, if someone who lived there, someone who worked there. Maybe if it's a business, go to the business next door and say, hey, have you heard anything about this place that has having paranormal activity? I'm writing a book, or I'm, writing a paper. I know I actually do a ghost tour here locally, and when we were putting the script together for the ghost tour, getting stories for the ghost tour, I mean, it was literally a lot of footwork of, hey, we're putting together a tour, so we know the history of this building. Have you seen anything? Have you had an experience there? And some people brushed us off and said, get out of my face, and other people were, oh my gosh, I've had so many weird things happen. And so a lot of it is word of mouth, a lot of it is the footwork and interviewing. And we have had luck with historical societies talking to us, because, those are typically employed, with people who, they've had experiences of their own. Our historical society was housed in an old courthouse, and their offices were right underneath the old jail cells. And they would hear banging on the pipes and footsteps and voices coming from upstairs when prisoners hadn't been housed there since the 70s. So, some of our best stories came from our historical society employees. But good luck. I'd love to know what in Western Maryland I can come hang out and investigate.
I had another quick question.
Go for it.
Um, so one of the aspects that I'm really interested in here is the relationship between you and your clients. I didn't know if you wanted to talk about that a little bit more. Particularly what I'm interested in is at the end of things. Once you've gone through the investigation, you've talked to the clients. Sometimes you have positive, sometimes you have negative experiences, obviously, but what are some of the more, I suppose, interesting dynamics between yourself and the clients? And is there a relationship that's maintained long after the investigation takes place?
It all depends. Sometimes clients, we hand them any evidence that we found, and they're happy. They're good. They're fine. And they don't ever call us again. Sometimes we actually had one client who, it wasn't a client that called us, it was their psychologist who called us. And so that relationship was pretty much us with the doctor. And that was interesting, because I remember when we, talk, and that's actually in the next book, we actually talked to the doctor and said, oh, this is something that you need to make a house visit. Like, this is not paranormal. This is definitely something going on with your client themselves mentally. Um, I had a client who, she called nonstop. There was a lot of phone calls. It was a lot of communication. And even after we told her, there's nothing bad happening, there's nothing demonic happening, there's nothing negative. It's, a lot of it is you're creating it. She didn't want to take no for an answer. She actually contacted another paranormal group. So sometimes people want the answers they want to hear, and if you don't give them that answer, they're going to go elsewhere. One of my favorite investigations was at an old historical home in North Georgia, and it was bought by a judge who wanted to turn it into a bed and breakfast, and he wanted activity so that he could advertise it as a haunted bed and breakfast. So that was fun. We went there 4 or 5 times. That was a dream location. So, and he's got a haunted bed and breakfast. It's awesome if he ever finishes it. He hasn't finished it yet. So hopefully he gets there. But, you know, the relationship is always, it always starts out, you know, tentative because the client has no idea who we are, and we have no idea if the client is safe, if they're okay, if they don't have anything mental health wise going on. And then typically it's, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you listened to me. I'm so glad you didn't tell me I was crazy. And they're always thankful. They're always, you know, most of the time they're very appreciative of the answers that we have, even if we don't have answers. Just the answer of telling them, you're not crazy. We were only there for 5 hours. You're there all the time. So, you know, that helps immensely sometimes too. I hope that answered your question some. Yeah, good. Awesome. Anyone else? Well, I know it's getting close to the 6 o'clock mark, and I know our host has had a long day. She's ready to go home. I figured I would take one last question if anybody wants to ask anything.
Well, or if you had one more story.
Oh, one more story. Okay. Let me think. Hang on. Um, Okay. This actually is my own house. And oh, that's okay. There we are. So probably the, you know, my house has intermittent slight activity. It's nothing crazy. And it's only every couple of years I'll have something happen. So I'm not sure if it's attached to my house or if it's attached to me having an investigation and something follows me home for a few days. But I was actually downstairs with my 3 children. My husband was at work, and they had eaten. They were on the floor playing with the dog, and they weren't loudly playing. They were rubbing her belly. It was pretty quiet. And I was sitting at the kitchen counter eating, and I heard someone upstairs in my bedroom cough. And it was so loud that I could hear it from downstairs. Someone coughed upstairs. There was no one else in the house. A few weeks later, I was answering the telephone. And typically, when I answer the phone and I say hello, and there's a pause, I know it's a telemarketer. So, of course, I do the angry hello. And my children, who were very short, were all in the living room watching TV. And they were watching Little Bear, which none of the characters sound anything like me. What was interesting, though, was I got that second ugly hello out. And something from behind me, right next to my ear, said hello in the same voice. And it wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from the other side of me, behind me. It was a mimic. A few years later in my house, we had a Mary Kay party, as girls like to do. We have makeup parties. And the lady who was running the party actually had set up in my living room and was taking orders in there. And she thought I had walked into the living room to give her my order. And she looked up and there was no one there. She had seen a shadow. And so then it all culminated in me having my group over to watch a premiere of Ghost Hunters. And a couple of the people in my group are sensitives. And I trust them pretty well and their perceptions because of my experiences with them investigating and what they've had happen to them. And so they all left, and about 10 minutes later, one of the sensitives called me and he said, "Hey, what's going on in your house?" And I said, "I'm cleaning up from the party I just had." And he said, "No, what's up with the old lady in the foyer?" I said, "There's no old lady in the foyer." He said, "Yeah, there's an old lady in the foyer." So I just sort of brushed him off and said, "Oh, you're funny." So then that following Christmas, I hadn't told anyone about it. That following Christmas, another of our sensitives we had everybody over at the house. We were all in the dining room getting food. And he looked at me and he said, "What's with the old lady in your foyer?" And I said, "Oh, you've been talking to Bob, haven't you?" He said, "What did Bob say?" So evidently there was someone hanging out in my foyer or in my house in general. So I've had a few things happen here that I think have just been involved with something following me home, nothing that's attached to the house. But that's probably some of my favorite stuff that's happened here where I live.
Any final questions?
Anyone? Nope.
All right.
Well, thank you guys. And for anyone that's on YouTube, make sure you check out my website, afutureghost.com. And if you're writers, write. Don't stop writing. You know, you don't have to go the agent publisher route. You can do it on your own. 21st century makes it easy and possible, and it's awesome. Good luck. And thanks for listening to me ramble on about the paranormal.